Good afternoon. One logistic note to start with, we're recording this call. Well, welcome. My name is Marcus Grubbs. I'm the Director of the Office of Enterprise Sustainability. We're in the Department of Administration. This is our annual Climate Week event. Thank you for joining us today. One note is we hit our registration cap for the event, so we have 1,000 registered participants. We are also we have a wait list of folks that couldn't register, and we're going to make the recording available to them after the call. It's a good problem to have. So today, I'm going to spend a few minutes sharing about the enterprise sustainability effort and how you as a state employee can help make state operations more sustainable. Then we'll hear from Dr. Kenneth Blumenfeld, Senior Climatologist at the State Climatology Office, and Commissioner Gronvall from the Department of Administration will introduce agency leaders to provide insights into the Minnesota Climate Action Framework update. And without further ado, so what is sustainability? In the state operations, we define sustainability here, but the important part is we're trying to maintain economic viability, be socially responsible, and preserve natural resources. The state as a operation, the enterprise, which is largely most of our executive branch agencies, have shared goals around sustainability, and you can see them here. Reducing our energy use, reducing our fuel use in the fleet, increasing our diversion of solid waste, and others. And importantly, we also look at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our operations over time. Agencies play a big role in this, right? They own the operations and they have the ability to change their operations to reduce their environmental footprint. And so agencies all have a designated sustainability coordinator. So if you are interested in sustainability at your agency, or you have an idea, you can reach out to the sustainability coordinator to get involved. Many agencies will have a green team or a sustainability team or an energy team that works on those topics. At the conclusion of this call, we'll send out the link to the video, but also a list of all of the sustainability coordinators at each of your agencies. So our agencies also, they come together with our sustainability coordinators to talk about challenges and barriers and opportunities to be more sustainable. We have work groups with on specific subjects where we share best practices, and agencies have a sustainability action plan to help guide their work into the future. They also provide lots of data on the operations of their agencies, including their building energy use, their fleet fossil fuel use, and so on. And so you can learn more at sustainability.mn.gov. This is the landing page where we highlight the costs avoided from conservation measures and also the annual average avoided emissions in our operations from our baseline. You can further navigate on the page and explore each of these topics, our goal areas. And when you go into those goal areas, you can see data. So we report annually at the state and agency level around these goals. And so if you're curious about how you're doing, you can check it out there. Or if you're curious about how the state's doing overall, you can also look. So most importantly, all of us share a role in this work. And so we have to think about ways that we do our job and how we can do it more sustainably. We can reduce our trips if we're driving a state vehicle or a personal vehicle for work. We can drive an electric vehicle. We can be conscious of the energy use, turn the lights off in the room when you leave, unplug that space heater. We can conserve water. We can sort our waste better, and we can be more conscious in our purchasing. So do we really need more 3-ring binders? Can we find some office supplies that were abandoned somewhere else in our agency to use instead of purchasing new? So several resources. Contact your sustainability coordinator. Visit sustainability.mn.gov. And you can email us, our team, the Office of Enterprise Sustainability, at mnsustainability@state.mn.gov. And there's also a learning module in the Enterprise Learning Management System. If you search sustainability, it'll come up. It's a brief module and it talks more about our work. And with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Kenneth Blumenfeld, who hardly needs an introduction, I think. He's been with us before to talk with you all, and he's joined us again today. So,
greetings and welcome to the Climate Week 2025 Climate Presentation Do-Over. We had initially intended for me to present this during a Climate Week discussion on Wednesday, September 24th. We had some technical difficulties, which culminated in me getting booted off of the exact network I was using to connect. And I think my screen froze somewhere in the middle of the presentation. And so that didn't work real well. So we're doing it over again so that people can see the presentation I intended to give. There will be some discontinuity between this and the panel discussion that did follow the failed presentation, because you might hear some references to, what Kenny was trying to say. In any case, I am Kenny Blumenfeld. I'm a climatologist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and I am going to talk to you today about kind of some of the recent climate highlights and extremes, and then how that fits into larger trends that we have observed in our climate in Minnesota, and some of what that portends for the future. So without further ado, I will share my presentation with you and we will begin. Okay. So today we're going to talk about Minnesota's climate. We will emphasize the recent switches between extremes, the long-term warming and moistening of our climate. In other words, we've gotten warmer and wetter on average, but it's important to keep in mind that the normal ups and downs that have always been part of our climate will continue. And one of the interesting things is that even though the 2020s have been very dry, we still, within those dry years, we see evidence of a continued wet trend. And if you see that kind of confused or displeased cat, I like to use our Microsoft 365 account, which comes with a lot of stock photos. And so I encourage people to find the stock photos that go best with whatever material they are sharing. There isn't enough time to cover everything. This is kind of think of this as a moderately in-depth overview of some of the big climate talking points. So the first thing we're going to do is just talk about the scale and the scope of some of the extremes we've experienced recently. The extremes are part of Minnesota's climate. They always have been, but I think you might find that in the recent few years anyway, we've had kind of a rapid succession of sometimes opposing extremes in a way that even climatologists would find to be somewhat unusual. So this first map is showing, we're going back to December 2023, so it's almost 2 years. And what this map is showing is how much warmer than normal different parts of North America were during that December of 2023, because that kicked off an unusually warm and also snowless winter. And it was the kind of winter where people were coming up to us in the climate office saying, hey, this seems really unusual, and we've seen some pretty unusual stuff. So just putting it in perspective, what you're really seeing is that almost everywhere in North America was much warmer than normal during December of 2023, but essentially all of those red areas, if you can see that, those kind of darker and brighter shades, even that pinkish area that you see up around Hudson Bay, that whole area that includes Minnesota and most of the central and northern part of the continent was essentially in record-setting territory in terms of temperatures. So it was a quite extreme anomaly or deviation from normal. One way to think of this too is that, and there's another stock photo of a deer. It doesn't really have anything to do with what I'm talking about. The when we look at how unusual the month was compared to other Decembers, it really stands out. So 2023 was by far the warmest December that we had measured in Minnesota, as long as we have statewide records. And this is kind of averaged over the state. And, you know, just to put it in perspective, last December, so December of 2024, also was very snowless and was pretty mild. And so we were getting a lot of calls from concerned folks saying, hey, this seems like a carbon copy or like a repeat of the December we had back in 2023. And so the purpose of including these two data points on this slide is to show they actually were nothing alike. I mean, they definitely were similar in that they didn't have snow, but the 2023 December was about 10 degrees warmer than the 2024 December. That's a huge margin. In fact, the 2023 December was about 5 degrees warmer than the second warmest December on record. And that is a huge margin to separate, you know, number one from number two. The photo on the left was taken during December of 2023. It was, you know, a bright, sunny, generally snowless month. And we had a lot of pictures kind of like that throughout the winter because it really wasn't just December. We had record temperatures again in January and in February and in March. We had some of the earliest 70-degree readings in this in state history that winter. So then we came out of this really warm and dry period, and we switched pretty quickly into a very wet period. I mean, honestly, looking at it from a climatological perspective, you could almost say that the dry period really ran right through March of 2024, and then it just stopped. We had a big snowstorm towards the end of the month, and by early April, we went into a pattern where we started getting precipitation, mostly rain, every 2 to 4 days, and that pattern continued from right around the 1st of April all the way into the early to middle part of July in most of Minnesota. So we had, you know, flooded fields, we had submerged farm equipment, we had 2 major rainfall events on top of that wet period. So that's what you see in that middle map. One of those events was up around Tower and Cook in northeast Minnesota. Those areas were inundated with extraordinary rainfall, equivalent to what you'd expect every 1 to 200 years in those locations. And that was, I think, around June 18th that rainfall hit. And then a couple days later, a similar magnitude relative to what's normal rainfall hit areas from near Mankato all the way into the southwest corner of the state, also producing rainfall totals that would normally recur every 1 to 200 years in those areas. So 2 high impact extreme rainfall events on top of a really wet pattern gets us to that map on the right, which shows that the southern half of Minnesota, by and large, was in the 99th percentile for precipitation for the whole period between April 1 and June 25. And part of northeast Minnesota was also. What that means is that was essentially the wettest such period on record. And then, almost as extraordinarily, this wet period that produced, you know, major flooding in northeast Minnesota and kind of infamous flooding in parts of southern Minnesota with the Rapidan Dam almost coming apart on live television. The spigot, so to speak, turned off sometime in the middle and later part of summer, depending on where you were. And the graph on the left is really just showing you a temperature pattern in St. Cloud, but this is representative of the whole state. The red bars pointing up are just warm days, and they're showing you how much warmer than normal a given day was beginning on June 1st. And the blue bars pointing down are just cool days, showing how cool a given day was relative to normal for that same period. And this goes from June 1st through September. And what you see in the first half, the kind of left side of that graph, is that pretty normal summer behavior where you had some warm days and then a cool front comes through and you had some cool days and then more warm and then cool, kind of the normal oscillation. And none of those in 2024, none of those temperature variations or deviations were that remarkable until we got into late August and especially September. And then we started getting these really large daily departures from normal, and almost all of them were very warm departures. So temperatures running 15, 20 degrees above normal for multiple days on end. And what this did was it helped evaporate a lot of additional water. There was a pretty pronounced dry spell at the time where many parts of the state only had 30 or had, sorry, many parts of the state had 30 or 35 days with no precipitation. And so that's a very long dry spell. And so when you combine the really dry conditions with the extremely warm conditions for that time of year, we were evaporating a lot of water, and we ran out of water pretty quickly. And as a result, Minnesota fell into drought quickly. So the map on the right is essentially a picture of what's called flash drought. You know, drought usually takes months to emerge. Sometimes it can take up to a year to emerge if depending on the progression of dry conditions. In this case, we went from having no drought anywhere in Minnesota to having some parts of the state in the third category of drought. That's called severe drought. And it only took 8 weeks to do that. So this is one of the fastest progressions of drought that we had seen. And it was, again, because following from the really wet spring and summer that we had, we went into an incredibly dry and also quite warm pattern, and that just threw us into flash drought over much of the state. So then we had this really warm and generally dry fall, and we had a snowless winter, but it otherwise wasn't that remarkable. Temperatures were pretty close to normal over most of the state, and it was that dry winter was bookended by some decent precipitation events. So we ended up, even though it was a sort of bad winter for recreation for the second winter in a row, we ended up pretty close to normal for total kind of long season precipitation. We didn't have major drought concerns when we came out of that last winter because of the precipitation that we got after the winter season. The main stories in 2025 have been, it's been generally pretty wet during the summer. We've had a lot of humidity. It's been warm, but not necessarily hot. And we had one just major thunderstorm event in northern Minnesota. This is by far the most important single weather event of the year in terms of impact, because at least through, the end of September, this was a what's called a derecho. It's a long-lasting, long-distance traveling thunderstorm complex producing extreme winds. It went from eastern Montana across North Dakota into northern Minnesota. It produced wind gusts of over 100 miles an hour in parts of North Dakota and northern Minnesota, including in Bemidji, where there was extensive damage, and we had damage to state parks and other state lands, forests. We also had damage in various municipalities, infrastructural damage along roads as power lines were coming down, street lights and stoplights were being disrupted, and there was even residential and structural damage. So that was a really large and high impact event. And then the other major story so far would be how smoky it's been. The graph on the right is just kind of a snapshot of that, and we're really thankful that the Pollution Control Agency has been alerting people to smoky conditions and poor air quality, and has also been serving and preserving a lot of the sort of climatological air quality data that they've been collecting, so that we can go back and see how bad the air quality was and look at the frequency of days with compromised air quality. And the graph is just showing the kind of daily worst air quality index values in Minnesota. And this is just the period from late July into early August. It was one of several different kind of smoke outbreaks that we had this summer, as we imported a lot of smoke from Canadian wildfires off in, especially in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So to recap, we went from, and this is just starting in late 2023, we had an extremely warm and dry winter. in 2023, 2024. And we followed that up with an extremely wet and, flood-inducing spring and summer in 2024. And then that was followed by some of the fastest and most rapidly advancing flash drought that we have observed. And then, we ended up after that kind of series of oscillating extremes, having a low snow but otherwise unremarkable winter. But then we got into a stormy pattern with, major thunderstorm event in northern Minnesota and also a lot of smoke. And this was really the third summer this decade with extensive smoke. And, we had nothing really like it in the 2010s. We were starting to get tastes of smoke where it would occur maybe several times in a summer. But the instances of these have really skyrocketed in the last several years. So now if we just kind of want to think about how does all of this fit in with our, bigger picture climate issues. Before we even talk about that, we should talk about what things we need to know about Minnesota's climate in the first place. So one is we have a naturally extreme climate with a lot of variability and a lot of weather hazards. What this means is that, we're used to very cold winters and generally very warm, humid summers, even if some winters are shorter or longer than others, or some summers are shorter or longer than others. The high variability is what tells us that we know not to expect the exact same winter or summer or fall or spring or year 2 or 3 years in a row. We are used to going from, a warm winter one year to a cool winter the next, or the same thing could be true with summer. And those kind of normal variations, we call them just ups and downs, those are very much part of our climate. They've been observed for, really for as long as there have been people in Minnesota. And so that variability is definitely part of our normal climate. And we also have many weather hazards. So we get tornadoes, we get blizzards, we get straight line thunderstorm winds and hailstorms, we have flash floods, we get drought, we have wildfires. I mean, they're also part of our climate. So those are, before you start talking about what's changing, you kind of need to establish those facts about Minnesota. This is already a very moody climate with a lot of talent. It can do a lot of things. Now you have to start adding in what else is happening to the climate. So the second point is that global temperatures have risen rapidly in recent decades, and some of the extremes in terms of global temperatures that were observed in the last 2 years are really unprecedented in human history. So not just in terms of what you see on this graph, which goes back to about 1850, but you could quite likely, based on paleological records, from ice cores and from certain types of sediments, and there is evidence that this was some of the warmest, maybe the warmest conditions that had been that are measurable going back hundreds of thousands of years. So some kind of really new levels of extremes. These wouldn't be the warmest conditions, since Earth became a planet, because we've had some incredibly warm conditions, but there weren't people on the planet when those conditions occurred. So we've got rising temperatures globally, and those rising temperatures are, have reached kind of new heights and new extremes very recently. Now, whenever the global temperatures rise, whether it's from a natural cause like we would have had from geologic or astronomical sources, in previous millennia, or from more human causes, which is mostly what we are observing now, the same general thing happens, is that, there's more heat available, and because higher temperatures will evaporate more water, then you're generally moving more water out of the oceans and into the air. And so that gives an average area more access to not just the heat, but also the water vapor or the humidity. So you have rising global temperatures, and that leads to more availability of heat and also more availability of moisture. In Minnesota, what this means is that, well, we have the Gulf right to our south. It's less than 1,000 miles away from southern Minnesota. And so anytime the wind blows from from the south, we get that evaporated ocean moisture delivered right into our region. And so those southerly winds are often delivering higher amounts of water vapor or humidity than would have been delivered previously when the global temperatures were lower. Because again, remember, there's more moisture evaporating off of the oceans and being put into the atmosphere. The way that our climate has responded in general so far is that we've become warmer and we have become wetter. This graph, I know it can be really confusing to see a big scattery graph like this, but this is showing every year back to 1895, right through 2024, looking at the combined average temperature across Minnesota for each of those years with the combined total precipitation averaged across Minnesota for each of those years. So you can't necessarily see what year a given dot was unless we went in and labeled it. On the left side of the graph, you have cool years, and on the right side, you have warm years. And on the bottom of the graph, you have the dry years, and at the top, you have wet years. And these are all relative to those axes you see in the middle, which are the 20th century averages. So in the lower left quadrant, you have the years that were cool and dry compared to 20th century averages. And in the upper right quadrant, you have the years that were warm and wet because compared to 20th century averages. And the labeled years, especially those red labeled years are showing you the 10 combined warmest, wettest years on record. Now remember, this whole period goes back to 1895. This period of record is 1895 through 2024. And the combined 10 warmest and wettest years on record are all from 1998 on forward. In other words, they've all occurred in the last 28 years. And statistically, the chances of that happening at random are incredibly low. In other words, that means there's kind of a systemic shift towards warmer and wetter conditions. Not every year is warm and wet. You can notice 2019 kind of on the upper slightly left side, that was our wettest year on record, but it was somewhat cool compared to the historical averages. And throughout this graph, there's some unlabeled recent years that would show up as warm and dry or kind of near the middle or also cool and slightly wet. However, in that 28-year period since 1998, 28-year period, we don't have any years that were both cool and dry. And in fact, you'd have to go back several decades before you would find even just one year that qualified as cool and dry for compared to the historical averages. So we have shifted towards warmer and wetter conditions, even though those warm, wet conditions aren't combined every single year, and they certainly don't occur every single year. So spelling that out further, it just means that temperature and precipitation and humidity are all increasing in Minnesota. So our winter conditions are where we see the most warming. Also overnight temperatures tend to be rising faster than daytime temperatures. So basically the lowest temperatures are coming up faster than the highest temperatures. So we're kind of cutting off the bottom of our temperature distribution and not adding that aggressively to the top of it, if that makes sense. So we're losing the low values faster than we're gaining the really high values. On average, we have both more rain and snow, but you have to remember with all of this, the ups and downs that are part of our climate, the normal variations that are part of our climate do continue and will continue even as we see these trends. So it doesn't mean that every year is warmer than the last year, every year is wetter than the last year. It's just that on average, both temperature and precipitation are increasing over time. And snowfall is increasing too, which is an interesting one because our winter is what's warming the fastest and we're getting more precipitation extremes. The map just shows you, the maps at the bottom on the left show you how much our temperature has changed in total since 1895. The lower left map is just the average annual temperature. So that would be like every day of the year averaged over every year from 1895 right through, we even go through 2024 here. And you can see it's about a little over 3 degrees of warming, total warming on average, but that's average throughout the year. If you look at wintertime low temperatures, so the average daily minimum temperature from December through February, that's where you really see even more warming. Over 6.5, almost 7 degrees of average warming of our winter lows in Minnesota, with the highest warming occurring, or the most warming occurring, in northern Minnesota. And then on the right map there, that's showing the same thing except for summertime high temperatures. So the daily high temperatures from June through August, they do show modest increases in central and northern Minnesota, with actual decreases, very slight decreases in southern Minnesota. And this just shows that our climate is warming. We've warmed by over 3 degrees throughout the year, but that warming is really being led by winter warming, and much less so by summer warming. You may have heard, however, September, which is kind of caught between those two seasons, is warming very, very quickly. It's warming much faster than any of the non-winter months. So that's kind of one small exception here. And then on the right, what we have, we recently completed an analysis with the help of one of our IDEC intern. And this one is, we took all the stations that have qualifying precipitation going back to the middle of the 20th century, and we're just trying to understand what the trends in extreme and heavy precipitation look like now. And this particular graph just shows, of all of these stations that qualify for the study, which one had the most and how much was it precipitation each year, going from 1948 to 2024. And what you see is an upward trend, so that on average, the wettest year, the wettest total for the year has increased by over 8 inches in that 70 plus year period. So that's a pretty dramatic increase. And a lot of this is occurring in southern and central Minnesota, especially, but this is a statewide average here. If the maps and graphs don't make any sense to you, then on the left there's a picture of a warm and snowless winter, and on the right there's a picture of heavy and extreme precipitation causing a flood at Gooseberry Falls. When we look at projections, these images were provided by the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. On the left, you see the frequency of days where you get at least 4 inches of rain in Minnesota. That's an extreme rainfall event. It's kind of the entry level for what you think of as an extreme rainfall event. It's usually going to cause at least some flooding, and if it's happening in a really wet period, it might cause major flooding. Rainfall amounts like that, generally, these don't qualify as 100-year rains. They're the kind of rains that would occur on average. That's what the map shows you, anywhere from maybe 2 to 4 times per decade in northwestern and northern, 2 to 4 times per century in northwestern and northern Minnesota, and maybe 6 to 10 times per century in southern and eastern Minnesota. So these don't even occur every decade on average throughout most parts of Minnesota. They're still pretty rare events, so think of it as like a 10 to 25-year event depending on where you are. When you look at pretty modest projections of the climate as you get into the middle of the century, they actually show these types of rains increasing by a factor of 2. In other words, becoming about twice as common, so that northwest Minnesota goes to maybe 4 to 8 days per century with that kind of precipitation event, and southern and eastern Minnesota is up in the maybe 12 to 14 or even 16 days per century range. So a pretty marked increase in the frequency. It doesn't mean that these kinds of events are going to start happening everywhere every year. And in fact, the projections compared to what we've observed already in this sense really do match our already ongoing observations, because if we went back 50 years and kind of asked the same question, how frequent are these 4-inch daily rainfalls, the map on the left would actually show about half the values of what it has now. So you'd see 1 to 2 days in northwest Minnesota and maybe 2 to 4, 3 to 6 days in southern and eastern Minnesota. So there already is an increase in the frequency of these types of heavy and extreme precipitation events, and the projections indicate those will continue. One of the big changes, though, in addition to precipitation, which has a high impact, has been a little more subtle, and it's a little more survivable. So it doesn't maybe register for a lot of people as a major or an important extreme. But we've really lost cold weather statistics and the performance of kind of our cold weather season in Minnesota in a big way. Uh, we just have a hard time getting as cold as we used to get. And so at International Falls, for example, which is considered the ice box of the nation, it's essentially for the lower 48, it's essentially has the lowest winter temperatures for the contiguous US of any first order climate station in that area. So it's kind of deserves its reputation as the ice box of the nation. And an average January minimum daily temperature, so low temperature, is now about 11 degrees warmer than it was just 7 decades ago. And these are changes we see across the state, maybe slightly different magnitudes in different places, but that coldest time of year is much warmer than it used to be. So the coldest nights of the year are much warmer than they used to be. We just don't get cold the way we used to. What we now think of as cold used to be fairly common, and what we used to think of as cold is either quite rare or doesn't even occur anymore over most, if not all, of Minnesota. And as a result of this warming of our winter, and also just the general warming of the climate, especially during winter and in those shoulder seasons, we've started losing the amount of time that we spend, with freezing conditions. So our frost season, our freeze season, is being constricted on average, and you can see lots of ups and downs on this graph too. So it's not happening the exact same way everywhere every year, but on average, we've lost about a week of the frost season on the early side of that season. So in other words, the first frost day where it's below freezing or freezing is coming about a week later in the fall. And then that final freeze of spring is generally coming 1 to 2 weeks earlier. So when you put that together, it's a 2 to 3 week loss on average. Varies a little bit around the state, but a 2 to 3 week loss of our freezing season. And that has also led to things like shorter lake ice cover seasons. And not surprisingly, because we have more precipitation falling, but our winter temperatures are increasing the fastest, we're starting to get more days where it rains in the wintertime. So in most of Minnesota, it looks like in the last 7 decades or so, we've seen approximately a doubling of the frequency of days where it rains during the wintertime. It's still pretty rare in most of Minnesota to have, you don't usually have more than 5 or 7 days where it's raining, even in southern Minnesota, but those frequencies are nevertheless about twice as high as they were 60, 70 years ago. Now, even though we're getting more rain and even though our winters have warmed so much, this particular graph shows with the red line that our snowfall season is warming. So this is the period from November through April. It's warmed by several degrees in the last several decades, but it's still below freezing. And because there's more moisture arriving, what this means is we often actually are still getting heavy snow, and even more heavy snow than we used to get. It's not necessarily that the number of days with snow have increased. It's that when it snows, we tend to get a bit more than we used to. So the number of days where you maybe need to bring out snow plows because there's 4 inches of snow falling or more, and we're using the 5 major climate stations in Minnesota, we're getting more of those types of days, more of these days with heavy snow. So even as our snowfall season is warming and our winter is warming in general, we're seeing increases in instances of heavy snow. No surprise that at a place like Duluth, which just 3 winters ago now broke its all-time seasonal snowfall record, and it's been receiving as much snow in recent years and decades as ever in its history. But because of the kind of warming that's affecting everywhere in Minnesota, including Duluth during the wintertime, and because of the presence of more rain falling instead of snow during the winter, we are melting more of that snow after it falls. And as a result, we're spending less time during the winter with actual quality snow cover, with deep snow on the ground. And the average snow depth during the December through February winters has decreased, in some cases up to 30 or 40%. In Duluth, it's about 25%. But so we've really, even though our winters have warmed, and even though snowfall has generally stayed high or increased over most Minnesota stations, we're seeing long-term decreases in snow cover statistics because we just can't keep snow on the ground the way we used to, even if we're receiving more snow. Meanwhile, the summertime high temperatures don't show the kinds of increases that we see with the wintertime low temperatures. The highest temperatures, so we're taking you out to Milan, which is the greatest of our climate stations in Minnesota. It's one of the best in the country. It's 3 generations of observers in a rural area, so they don't have any contamination from urban infrastructure that makes it kind of artificially hotter. And it's a good station to use. And when we look at summertime high temperatures, they really don't show any long-term increase. These are the highest highs of summer. So we're looking at the very hottest day, and we're also looking at the average of the 15 hottest days. And there's essentially no trend. Now, one of the things that we have to consider, though, is that there are parts of the United States and parts of the world that do have summers getting hotter in terms of higher temperatures. And on the right, this is kind of showing, again, a fairly, a not particularly aggressive climate projection, showing that the number of 90-degree days by the middle of the century is really going to skyrocket compared to where it is now. Now, one of the things that we understand in the Climate Office is that even though we haven't gotten hotter in terms of air temperatures, we have started to see more instances of high humidity in the summertime. And when that humidity combines with air temperatures, it can make it feel much warmer than the air temperature itself would actually indicate. And so even though we have not yet observed increases in the number of days where it's 90 degrees or increases in the temperature during the hottest day of summer, we have observed increases in the number of days where the heat index is 90 degrees or higher, and also increases in the highest heat index value of the year. So one piece of kind of context here, or one caveat to consider when we say, well, the high temperatures aren't increasing yet, when you factor in humidity, we are actually seeing increases in especially extreme summertime heat across Minnesota. And this particular graph, I know it looks really confusing, especially if you don't like reading graphs, but what it's showing you is that the highest temperature kind of late in the day, right at the evening time, where we have a long record of evening observations going back over 100 years in the Twin Cities. So we can use this, and we also have moisture readings going back over 100 years. But even just looking at the period since 1970, when we've seen the most total warming, that black line shows that in the Twin Cities, which is in an urban area, which does produce artificial heat that would tend to increase temperatures over time as the urban area expands, we actually see the sort of evening temperatures, the highest evening temperatures of summer, showing us either no trend or a very, very slight decrease in the Twin Cities. However, the highest heat index values, when you include the effects of humidity, are showing an increase, and it's a fairly pronounced increase. And this is what we are seeing across the state. So the high temperatures appear to be flat, but once you factor in humidity, you have increasing heat index values. So we are being exposed to more extreme and intense summer heat, even though we're not necessarily observing that with the behavior of just our high temperatures. Something that's confused a lot of people, because it had been so wet in the 2010s and even the 2000s that we had during those periods a few drought episodes, but it had been a while since we had really persistent, repetitive drought instances, and now we've had that in the 2020s. And so I think a lot of people who hadn't experienced drought before were assuming that this was the driest period on record, or maybe the worst drought that we'd ever had. And this graph is just attempting to take one of the metrics that we can push back really far, and it kind of makes an equivalent drought category, series of drought categories. And what it's showing is the percent of Minnesota that's covered by different drought categories, and then the severity of the drought in terms of those categories. And what you see is that back in the 1920s and 30s, and even in the 50s, 60s, and 80s, we had essentially more widespread, more prolonged and more severe drought than we have had in the 2020s. Now, that's not to diminish the the severity and what people experienced. I'm not trying to suggest that it wasn't a major drought episode that we had in 2021 or 2022 or 2023, or even that flash drought we had last year. It's just to say that the severity, the aerial coverage, and the duration really don't match episodes that we had in the past. And if anything, up till now, even when you include the current dry decade that we're in, there's kind of a long-term decrease in drought frequency and severity. But as we showed at the beginning of this discussion, sometimes we're getting these back-to-back extremes where you go from almost unprecedented levels of precipitation to rapid descent into major drought conditions. And that seems to be a little bit unusual. We don't see those types of oscillations historically like we have seen recently. A lot of people are interested in severe convective storms, tornadoes, hail, damaging winds. We don't see any long-term increases in their frequency or their severity, but in both cases, they have expanded across the calendar, so they take up more space. They tend to occur earlier on average and also later on average than they used to, so that window of time is expanded. And they're also covering wider areas than they used to, as we've seen tornadoes. For example, the tree damage that you may or may not be able to see on the left there was from a tornado that crossed basically through the boundary waters and went into Canada in October. So both very far north and also very late in the season. And then on the right, that animation is showing you a really extraordinary storm that happened the same year in December. It was December 15th, where we had over 20 tornadoes in Minnesota, plus straight line winds. We also had a blizzard in central and northern Minnesota, and a regional kind of gusty wind event where we had strong winds lasting 6 to 12 hours after the severe thunderstorms moved through, affecting much of central and southern Minnesota. So that kind of thing, although not becoming commonplace, and certainly I wouldn't be expecting it every year, I think these late season severe weather events that are combined with more traditional winter type weather are going to be a little bit more common as we get into the future, because there's more warming occurring during the winter, and that's pushing the storm season later and later into fall and even into winter. And then lastly, we have kind of emerging hazards from wildfire, and especially from air quality. I mean, so far in Minnesota, I don't believe we have any data suggesting that wildfire incidence has increased dramatically over historical levels. Wildfire has always been kind of part of our climate, but there certainly have been more fires in Canada in the last several years than would have been historically normal. And some of these have been quite large. And the result, and this might be because of the way that the trees and the forests of Canada have been weakened by even greater warming, especially during the winter, than we've had here in Minnesota. But the result is that whenever the winds turn around from the north or northwest and blow from those regions that are experiencing significant wildfires, we end up getting the smoke. And we've had these really high number of smoke days this past year, and also in 2023 and 2021. And those seem to be, at least compared to recent decades, pretty unusual for Minnesota. We don't have anything that we know of that rivals the smokiness of the last few years any time in the last several decades. So to summarize all of this, we've had a dizzying pattern of recent extremes, but the main trends continue. We are on average getting warmer and on average getting wetter, and we have increased humidity. Now, the projections, which we looked at a few of them, they indicate essentially more of everything, and also more humid heat waves, which we're already observing. So even though we don't necessarily see hotter or higher air temperatures during the summer, we are in many ways seeing more extremes of heat when you account for the effects of humidity, which actually can make heat harder to bear than if you just have a regular high temperature. The severe weather season is expanding, and the areas that are affected by severe weather are expanding, even though we don't really see major changes in the frequency, the overall frequency and the overall intensity of these weather events. We're still, however, of course, susceptible to really extraordinary severe weather damage, as we saw this summer in Bemidji. And again, wildfire and degraded air quality are new and emerging hazards. So hopefully this recording went better than what we attempted during Wednesday, September 24th. But yeah, and that's all I've got for you. So I assume, those of you who were able to hang on through this, you're pretty much ready for something else now. But thank you very much. Appreciate your patience with everything. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to stop the recording.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm Tamar Grunwald. I'm the commissioner here at the Minnesota Department of Administration. And if Kenny jumps back in the next minute or so, I will turn it back to him, given that we're doing pretty well on time. But I also wanted to take the opportunity to introduce the other leaders that are part of today's discussion, 3 other leaders here at our agencies who can talk about our climate subcabinet and talk about the status of the climate action framework and the next opportunity for public input. And just to remind folks again, thank folks again for your participation every day. The work that you do is important. As Marcus Grubbs, the director of the Office of Enterprise Sustainability, pointed out, each and every one of us as both as state employees and as leaders has a role to play in making a climate better for everybody in our community, ourselves and our neighbors. So again, I want to just remind everybody of each individual action makes a difference. So anyway, I'm going to turn back to our panelists here. This climate action framework that these folks are going to talk about today positions Minnesota in the lead to mitigate and adapt to climate change in an equitable manner. And again, this is very timely given some of the challenges we're seeing at the federal level, but Minnesota has the opportunity to continue to lead. So our first panelist is Dr. Kate Knuth, who's the climate director at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And we also have joining us Peter Brickwitty, former colleague of mine at the Department of Commerce, who's the Senior Director of Insurance Sustainability and Climate Change at the Department of Commerce, and Eric Rudin, who's the Acting Assistant Division Director at the Department of Transportation, and I believe also is the Director of Government Affairs at the Department of Transportation as well. So I will turn it over to our panel, and we'll stay tuned as to whether Kenny can come back and join us.
All right, thank you so much, Commissioner. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Knuth, the Climate Director at the Pollution Control Agency, and the team I lead at the PCA holds the center of the organizing for the climate change subcabinet, and that's the now 17 agencies that have come together to develop the climate action framework and are currently in the process of updating it. So 3 years ago this month, Minnesota released a climate action framework. Our first framework to create a bold vision for the state, invite conversation, invite action for Minnesotans as individuals, and even more working through communities and collectives to make the kind of progress we need to achieve our goals. So this framework, both developing it and then post-publication, has helped Minnesotans think about and then really importantly act on addressing climate change in their communities. So if you want to move to the next slide. The vision is really 3 parts. And when we think about this work and talk about this work, I think my colleagues will reiterate this, we talk about these as co-equal pillars of our climate vision. The first is carbon neutrality, and Minnesota is aiming to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and balancing any emissions that we do have of that at that time with carbon storage, especially in our landscapes. The second pillar of the vision is resilient. So we want Minnesota communities, businesses, the natural environment be able to plan for climate impacts that Dr. Blumenfeld was talking about, and then respond to and importantly recover from those impacts so all Minnesotans can thrive in the face of these challenges. The third pillar is equitable, and we acknowledge and recognize that all Minnesotans feel the impacts of climate change, but some feel them more because of inequitable and inaccessible systems, and that our climate actions, we work to make sure that we're having a fair distribution of the costs and benefits of action now and with future generations. And as we're moving through our climate planning, ensuring meaningful participation for all Minnesotans in that planning. Next slide. In the Climate Action Framework 3 years ago, we published new targets. And now if you're in the middle of this work, these are just the targets we work with, but a reminder that the framework did put out more ambitious targets than were in state law, and that is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 from a 2005 baseline and net zero emissions by 2050. These targets are actually now in state law, which is a positive impact of the Climate Action Framework. We're also looking to prioritize resilience investments over the next decade, recognizing that investments we make now have benefits for communities well into the future as climate change continues to unfold. Next slide. And I think now I'm turning it over to Peter Brickwitty.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everybody. So the Climate Action Framework, as Kate was talking about, our guide for our work is organized around 7 goals, and you see them here on the slide. So clean transportation represents our greatest opportunity to reduce climate pollution, connecting Minnesotans with sustainable and affordable transportation and transit options. Climate smart and natural and working lands are spaces where we can absorb and store carbon, reduce emissions, and sustain our local economies. Resilient communities at a state and local level help equip Minnesotans with the tools that they need to adapt to these extreme weather events that are being driven by changing climate. Investing in clean energy will help create jobs and lower energy costs. And having healthy lives and communities for all Minnesotans across the entire states is paramount to achieving our equity goals, and keeping in mind that some communities experience the impacts of climate change more than others. Clean economy focuses on jobs and transitioning to climate solutions that benefit everyone in every corner of our state. And finally, we're looking at efficient and resilient buildings within our resilient communities that withstand the impacts of climate change and reduce our energy consumption. So these are the areas of organization for our work, but also are how we're trying to approach realizing that ultimate vision of a carbon neutral, resilient, and equitable future for everyone in our state. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to report that we have taken some pretty giant leaps towards making our Climate Action Framework a reality over the past 2 years. During the 2023 legislative session, we funded more than 40 climate initiatives with over $1 billion of investment. And that's positioned our state as a national leader in climate solutions, helping Minnesota remain a great place to live, work, and raise a family for generations to come. Most of those 2023 legislative proposals were based directly on actions that were included in the original version of the framework. And those laws that we passed have sprouted into programs that are helping Minnesotans save money on their energy bills and do things like access electric vehicles and prepare for extreme weather events. Next slide, please. And so while we've made that significant set of initiatives a reality, and we're making significant progress on climate action, we still have a lot of work to do. And you can see what's ahead of us on this slide. This chart contains data from our state's latest greenhouse gas inventory, which was released in January of this year. And it shows Minnesota's greenhouse gas emissions over time compared to our statutory goals. And so the good news is that our emissions have dropped by 14% since between 2005 and 2022. But the state did see a 6.4% increase in emissions between the end of 2020 and the end of 2022. As everyone knows, the pandemic changed how we lived and worked in 2020 and 2021, and those changes resulted in the big reduction in emissions that you see on the graph. But as we return to pre-pandemic routines, emissions that had dropped in those 2 years rebounded. And that's not unique to Minnesota. That's a trend that we've seen nationally. So despite that rebound, emissions from the transportation sector, energy sector, and agriculture remain below 2019 levels, which indicates that we're making progress. And hopefully we'll start to see impacts from some of these initiatives passed in 2023 as we produce the next report. And I think with that, I'm handing it off to Eric.
All right, thank you, Peter. And just maybe one more comment on that last slide. As somebody here from the Transportation Agency, I just want to encourage people, there's certainly value to in-person work, but there's also value in working from home and not getting in a vehicle to drive to the office every day. So I think before the pandemic, telework was kind of almost like a fringe thing, but that really proved that telework is a viable way to operate. So just keep that in mind, please, going forward. So the new funding that was mentioned does allow us to be a lot more ambitious in meeting our climate action goals. So we're taking the opportunity to update the climate action framework this year to provide more specific actionable steps to guide climate action at the necessary pace and scale. This climate subcabinet that was mentioned earlier will release an updated framework in 2026 with a stronger focus on collaboration with local governments, community benefits, and workforce needs. And again, from the transportation perspective, some of those local government actions like land use planning, designing communities for active transportation like bicycling and walking really can help us get to our goals. So we're excited about that. And the updated framework will reflect new opportunities for climate action that have been funded over these past few years. Move to the next slide. So throughout 2025, there have been multiple opportunities to provide feedback on the Climate Action Framework update. In January, we collected feedback on a basic outline of proposed ideas for the updated framework. And then we took this feedback and drafted a list of action steps that will be included in each of the framework goals. So this was released for public comment in July. And then finally, after implementing feedback on the action steps, we'll be releasing a draft of the updated climate action framework for in mid-October for public comment. So be sure to keep your eye out for that. And with that, I think I will pass it back to Marcus at this point.
Great. Commissioner, did you have any thoughts?
Thank you again for each of you and the work that you're doing with this climate action framework. Being part of the climate subcabinet, it is exciting to see Minnesota lead in this space and weather all the different challenges that we have, both as a changing society and also some of the pressures from outside of Minnesota and at the federal government. So thank you both. Thank you all, Kate, Peter, and Eric. As I mentioned again, it's really impressive what we're doing here throughout the entire enterprise that state agencies are doing on their own to advance this climate change work across the state. So I'm particularly excited to see where we go next. How do we continue to adapt and evolve the state's climate action framework? And really, to each and every one of you, you are important to this process. Everybody's actions matter and leadership matters. So thank you all. Keep up really the good work. And a reminder that you all can learn more on the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's website by searching Minnesota Climate Action Framework. So great. great. And it's just amazing to have this level of interest and participation. I'm a little bummed Kenny had to drop off, but also amazed at what technology really allowed us to do today together. And maybe we'll have another chance to have Kenny back and he can finish the rest of those slides. Because I know weather is something we all care about, impacts us, impacts our economy, and impacts our neighborhoods and communities too. So thank you, Marcus. I will turn it back to you.
Well, I don't think there's anything left for me to say. I appreciate you all giving up your lunch hour to join us. And with that, we'll conclude the meeting. Have a great day.